Hello and welcome to the Cryptocurrency News channel. Once again, we're doing a video on China. It's the weekend. I already made a couple crypto videos. We'll have a stream later, but we're going to talk about why China can't ever be a superpower, why it's about reached its peak. I know that some of you who listened to Joe Rogan's podcast when he had that guy on, that guy was fundamentally right. There's a couple of things I think he really exaggerated on, but he was fundamentally right on the reasons why China won't be an actual superpower. China is not a superpower right now. It doesn't have global projection. It has regional projection. Yes, they bought like some rights in Africa and stuff, but they can't project their power all over the world like the U.S. can. Their military just doesn't have that kind of strength right now. I doubt it'll ever have that kind of strength. And I think China has essentially peaked in terms of its power. And the thing is about the Chinese GDP, they kind of found out that some of those numbers were actually made up, and it might not be as high as they reported. Because, with Chinese numbers, they just kind of they actually have a real, an internal number, and then they decide to report a number that looks good. As an example, and sometimes they get caught because it's ridiculous. As an example, back in 2019, they reported that all Chinese deaths within China only amounted to about 790,000. That means old age, disease, etc., etc. And then someone of course, no one in China dares question the party's lying because they don't want to be thrown in jail. But someone from the outside, basically in a United Nations type of conference, what happened to the rest of those people? Because generally, China, generally in a country like that, you would have about, you have 1.4, 1.5 billion people. You get about roughly 10 million deaths, if not a little bit more, 11 million deaths per year. You guys might think that's a lot, but if you really think about it, that's less than 1 in 100 people dies per year. And if you just spread out the age range of the population, that's about right. 1 out of every 100 people will actually die. If people average 100 years of life, that means 1 person out of 100 would die. And since the mean age is, not the mean age, since the average lifespan is less than 100, you get probably 1 in 100 people, slightly more than 1 in 100 people that essentially die each year out of natural causes or whatever. So that would, right now in China, the expected numbers maybe 11 million, 12 million people out of a country of 1.4 billion that die. But they came out with a number in 2019 that said only 790,000 people have died. So people were like, what happened to the rest of those people? Why isn't the population increasing that much? And then you know what the Chinese guy said? He's like, well, that was just a prediction, and predictions can be wrong. That's kind of speak for yeah, we totally made that up, and we can't really answer your question right now. Just the same thing with, the COVID response. For a month, they were we only had 600 people die. And then they couldn't BS that anymore. We only had 60,000 people die. And of course, no one actually believes that, not even people in China. Just by the rate of their crematoriums, there's probably over 1 million to 2 million people dead because of COVID. Just by how their crematoriums are operating over time, and how usually they only operate a half or a third of the time without any issues. So that's that. And the thing is, with their GDP numbers, they probably do the same thing. So, the GDP numbers from China, they're probably somewhat in that field, but I don't think they're quite as big as they actually make it out to be. It is growing, however, but I think the growth rate is actually slowing down. For instance, they said their GDP actually grew by 3%, which no one outside of China believes. I don't even think people in China believe it because they were completely shut down last year. They didn't lift the COVID policy until earlier in January this year. So they were completely shut down. Businesses were flat. People were having trouble getting groceries and stuff. So the GDP must have been negative. Pretty much every single outside source, plus some internal sources have said the GDP growth was probably negative last year. Yet the party said they grew about 3%. So obviously you can see that the party's making stuff up just to make things look good and trying to make contain disaster numbers and not let the public know how much disaster it actually is right now. Second of all, Chinese technology, a lot of it is actually borrowed. And without the technology and with these embargoes going on from the United States and other places, they really can't move up the ladder in terms of military technology. And what I'm talking about is the ban on Huawei, the ban on chips overall to China. That's not a problem they can solve. You can see since the ban on Huawei, back in 2018, Huawei hasn't really done so well, especially compared to international competition. Obviously, they still have a foothold in China because China obviously provides a lot of advantages to its own companies. But since the chip pullback and since Google completely pulled their Android services from Huawei, their phones just aren't as good. Yes, they've come up with their own ecosystem, but it's nowhere near as good as Google's system. So the thing is, they just don't quite have the know-how or the technology. The thing is, the United States, even though it might take a few years, we actually have the expertise and the ability to actually manufacture the same quality of chips as TSMC, given a couple of years, and we're actually putting up plants in the United States. China doesn't have the know-it-all or the technology to actually do so. So China might try to manufacture chips, but they'll produce much inferior ones over 2 years. It's not only the shut off of chips high quality chips right now. It's also the fact that the technology and the know-it-all how to produce the best chips they don't really have in China. So that's not something like the United States where they can actually replace in 2 or 3 years. So the chips thing, it'll have some effect on consumer stuff, but the main thing it'll affect is military. Yes, the main thing it will actually affect is military. Military actually needs those high quality chips for a lot of its advanced hardware. And I think the Chinese military will fall more and more behind the American military in terms of hardware. You can always throw more bodies at stuff. They got a lot of people, but that can only go so far in modern warfare, as you're seeing it play out in Russia right now. Russia has a lot more people, but they're not making much progress because the quality of weapons that Ukraine's getting from NATO is much better, even though those are only pretty much second-rate NATO weapons. We haven't given them any tanks. We haven't given them any of our newest drones or anything. Those are essentially older NATO weapons that they're actually getting right now. Because we've had the Bradleys essentially forever. So that's what you're seeing right now. And just for an example, the Chinese Chengdu J20, the cross-section of those is similar to an F-18, about 1 meter squared. Now, they have a decently small cross-section forward-facing, but side-facing and backward-facing, the cross-section is fairly big. Overall, the radar cross-section is about the same as an F-18, which is actually a failure for a stealth aircraft because the F-18 is a 4th-gen fighter, and it is actually not a stealth fighter. You can actually detect it on radar a lot easier than you can detect an F-35 or an F-22. And if you look at the Chinese carriers, they're based on really old Soviet technology. They're not nuclear carriers like the United States. So despite all this China technological bridging the gap with military, they are still decades behind in military. Actually, what I've heard from a former Chinese military worker, he said basically, yeah, the J-20 is not really a 5th-gen plane. It's more of a 3.8-gen plane. And, we've been debating, can it actually beat an F-16, a fighting Falcon, one of those upgraded F-16s right now? Because the upgraded F-16 is a 4.5. The F-16 would definitely have a bigger radar cross-section, but, the maneuverability and everything actually might be better for the fighting Falcon. And plus, the Fighting Falcon actually does have its own cannon if things actually get in close quarter combat, whereas I don't think the J-20 does. So, just based on military hardware, there is a pretty big gap. You can see the big gap between Russia and the United States, and I don't think the gap between China and the United States is any smaller. It actually might be bigger because China actually buys a lot of the technology from Russia. But that's not even the biggest problem why China won't become a superpower. It's actually what the guy on Joe Rogan's podcast actually said. It is the population problem. And this goes back to why China made up the statistic in 2019, saying that there was only overall 790,000 deaths in China. It's because they wanted to cover up the fact that the death rate could actually be bigger than the birth rate. Now, they should have made it more believable. I think there were roughly 10 million births in China that particular year. So if you said 9 million people died in China that year, that would have been believable. And I don't think people would have questioned it. If you say 790,000 people, no one's going to actually believe that. But the thing is, I think they're afraid of losing foreign investment and other people seeing the Chinese population is actually decreasing. But it is actually decreasing. In fact, the fertility rate of Chinese women is only 1.28 births per woman. And the replacement rate, which means your population doesn't increase or decrease, is actually 2.1. So you are basically 8.2 behind the replacement rate, which means the population of China would actually be going down pretty fast. So the problem with that is like if you don't have new people being born, you have a lot of people aging. When you have an aging population, you don't have enough of a worker base to actually support that aging population. The nation's economy will and can collapse. Now, in the United States, it is 1.64 births per woman, which is not enough for the replacement rate either. But the U.S. actually has a secret weapon in all this, and it's a weapon that a lot of like conservatives and GOP won't like. But the U.S. has immigration on its side. China does not have immigration on its side. Japan does not have immigration on the side. A lot of Europe they could, but it's actually harder to get citizenship over there than it is in the United States. No one actually wants to move to Canada because it's too cold. So like the United States has an advantage that those countries don't actually have. Also, a lot of those countries like China, Japan, and even a lot of the European countries are pretty much like ethnocentric, which means like there's not a lot of diversity in the population, which means like new people, they don't really want to move there because they feel out of place. The United States, fortunately, from its beginning has been a nation of immigrants. So there's a melting pot of cultures and there's a lot of small subcultures in the United States, which makes it more comfortable for people to actually move here. I mean, no one really wants to move to China anyways because they're authoritarian government. Japan doesn't have the authoritarian government, but like 99% of Japan's like Japanese. And like the economic opportunities there are going to be limited because it's already kind of like saturated there. So no, Japan has like a 1.38 births per woman, I think. And China's even slightly lower than that. So the problems Japan's facing now, China's going to hit that wall. Well, Japan's been facing the problem like for like the last 20, 30 years. China's going to hit that wall like very, very soon within the next 10 years, which means the economy is definitely going to start slowing down. In the next 10 years, they won't be able to support their elderly population. And that's the main problem. China doesn't really have any way to attract people to actually go there. They don't have any way to attract talent to go there either, like the United States. And the thing is, China's 1.28 births per woman will actually start to really, really, really hurt it because that is a drastic population decrease in the decades to actually come. You just won't have enough of a worker base. And to make it even worse, the male to female ratio is 104.7 males to 100 females. So basically you have 5 more males per 100 than females. And that is a big, big problem because that means 1 out of 20 Chinese men, even if they like wanted to get married, can't actually find a wife. And there's also the problem, well, like, high officials have like, obviously like multiple women outside of their actual wife. They don't really mention that, but trust me, it's true. But like the main problem is like, when you have like 5% of your population that's not able to find a mate, that further decreases your population issue, increases your population issue, I mean. And the thing is like, I know China is saying that you can have 2 and even 3 kids now, but here's the thing, no one wants to have 2 or 3 kids because as a country grows out of being agrarian, and grows more industrialized and developed, children become more of a financial liability than a financial benefit. If you're an agrarian economy, you don't really need to send all your kids to school and all that stuff. They don't really need to get educated. They just need to farm, and they're basically free labor on the farm. But as you graduate from an agrarian society to an industrialized one, you need specialized skills for kids to actually get a job, to support themselves, and you have to support that kid for longer, so it's very, very costly to support a kid. Now, based on like how much people make per salary, kids are actually more expensive in China than in the United States. So it's very unusual at this point for couples in China to have more than 1 kid just because the economic burden is too much to bear. So the reason China won't ever become a superpower, not at this rate at least, is because the chip ban, they don't have the means to get the technology to really match the United States. Like they can't attract talent because it's kind of a closed off environment and the economic opportunity really isn't there. And 3, they have a major, major population crisis because, there's way more males than females, 5% more in the population. The fertility rate is dropping. And the thing is like China can't depend on immigration like the United States can to bring in more people to supply its worker base. the United States has that advantage over pretty much every other developed nation. You might not like the low skilled workers. You might not like, like other people, like, Indian people or Chinese people getting H-1 visas or anything. But those people add to the tax base. And if nothing else, they add to the Social Security and Medicare base. Remember, Social Security and Medicare is a flatline cut from your paycheck. You don't really get that back. So the thing is, like, even as immigrants come in and they start working, and they start getting a paycheck, doesn't really matter how big or small that paycheck is. 15% of it gets automatically deducted and goes into the Social Security and Medicare fund. And that can actually fund your social programs for a lot longer than if your population is actually decreasing. I do think like attitudes towards immigration will actually change in the United States as economic reality eventually pushes out like white nationalism and basically ethnocentrism, because because white nationalism and ethnocentrism are more like ideologies, whereas economic reality is actually reality. And that actually affects, like, if seniors can get like the Social Security payments, if they can have food on the table and stuff like that. So that's going to be more important. I think that's eventually, the economic reality is eventually what's going to edge out like the white nationalism and the ethnocentrism, because it just won't be viable at that point. You need those people coming in, working, and then paying taxes to actually support the aging population. That's going to be a problem in all Western nations, but the US is going to be better off than most other developed countries at that point, because they do have the immigration factor that other countries don't. And the US would actually be pulling people from like countries like China and other countries and other people in other countries that actually need that population, because those people actually want to come here. So China has like a lot of major problems in terms of like technology, attracting talent, and population, and it won't really be able to support its aging population or be able to upgrade its technology to match the United States. So there could be other superpowers that arise in the future, but the trajectory that China is going at right now, it will never really become a superpower. It'll more likely have an economic collapse before it becomes any kind of superpower. So let me know what you think. Like and subscribe. Hit that bell notifications button. I do think that guy that Joe Rogan was interviewing was a little too extreme. I don't think China's in as dire of a strait as he made it out to look, but he wasn't too far off. And I do think they are kind of in trouble. So let me know what you think. Like and subscribe. Hit that bell notifications button, and I will see you guys later.